I recently found myself going down the rabbit hole of Japanese manga and anime fandom online. Now, this is something I know nothing about. I've never really been into anime or manga, but I was fascinated to learn about Van Hohenheim, or Hohenheim of Light, a character who is a powerful alchemist in the anime series Full Metal Alchemist, clearly inspired by the historical alchemist Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus. From what I read, it seems that this series uses many alchemical concepts, including the homunculus, which I will talk about later. Of course, it's sensationalized and highly exaggerated, but in all fairness, the series isn't pretending to be historically accurate or anything. Still, centuries after Paracelsus, it's incredible to see how he's still a part of the conversation when it comes to alchemy. Paracelsus was one of the most controversial people of his day, and his work and those of his followers deeply shaped the history of medicine and science. So in this video, I thought it would be interesting to introduce him, even though he's not remotely as handsome as Hohenheim of Light, and to talk a little bit about Paracelsianism too, from its connection to magic and alchemy, Protestantism and reform, to the idea of chemical medicine and even creating life from dead matter, like a Proto-Frankenstein tale of sorts, believe it or not. Of course, although this is a long video, it's just an introduction to all these subjects, and if you want to learn more, I highly suggest checking out the reading recommendations in the video description. Now, without further ado, let's dive into it. Hello, lovely history fans. I'm Dr. Julia Martins, and I'm a historian of gender and medicine. I study how the body was understood in the past and how that shapes the present. And I'm fascinated by alchemy. If you're new here, welcome. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more history videos. I also have a Patreon if you would like to support my work. Now, let's dive into the fascinating world of Paracelsus. There's even a basilisk involved, so I hope you enjoy it. Paracelsus was born in the Swiss village of Einsiedeln around 1493. His parents' marriage was what we could call something like mixed class, since his father was descended from the nobility, even though he was illegitimate, and his mother was a bondservant of a convent nearby. This meant that Paracelsus was something like a semi-serf. When he died, for instance, his belongings could be claimed by the religious authorities who had owned his mother's labor. I won't go into too much detail here, but his origins were very likely an obstacle to his social and professional rise, although he eventually became internationally renowned. And it also helps us to understand his sort of self-made man persona. Paracelsus' father was a physician who taught him much about medicine, botany, mineralogy, and mining. This will be crucial in a bit, plus natural philosophy. They moved to southern Austria, where Paracelsus attended the Bergschule, a mining school where his father taught. There, pupils would learn about mining operations and metals, such as iron, mercury, copper, and alum. So Paracelsus would have learned about these substances growing beneath the earth and how they could be transformed and combined. He would have heard of alchemists' quests to transform base metals such as lead into gold. He was also tutored privately, including by 4 bishops. So religion and magic were a big part of his education, as was the focus on practical knowledge. And you can see sort of all these different strands in his works. Paracelsus attended university for a time, but he was definitely not a fan. He would later write how high colleges produce many high asses. Instead, he preferred to wander and travel throughout Europe, including places such as England, Scotland, and Ireland. He became an army surgeon in the wars happening in the Netherlands, where he developed his skills, and he went as far as Russia. He was even imprisoned before escaping and going from Lithuania to Hungary before working as an army surgeon again in Italy. He eventually traveled to Egypt, Arabia, and the Levant, plus Constantinople. But he wasn't just looking for adventure. Paracelsus wanted to learn about alchemy in practice, but also to discover the hidden secrets of nature. For him, all this knowledge, and knowledge in general really, was based on experience. He wrote, "A doctor must search for old wives, gypsies, sorcerers, wandering people, old robbers, and such outlaws, and learn from them. A doctor must be a traveler." The Book of Nature was the only one worth learning from, and you had to do that through travel. Paracelsus described each land as a page to be read, that is, to be experienced. This was not unique to him. If you've been following the channel, you might remember the video I made a while back about Leonardo Fioravanti, a surgeon from Bologna who also wanted to reform medicine. Fioravanti's story has much in common with Paracelsus. Still, the idea of learning from unlikely sources can be found in many other popular books of the time, in which the importance of practical knowledge is highlighted, and how this knowledge often comes from people in the margins, in terms of gender, social status, or age, as you can see in these passages that I'll read now. I have acquired many beautiful secrets, not only from great learned men and great nobles, but also from poor little women, from craftsmen, from peasants, and all kinds of people. Another one reads, I always looked for precious experiments, whether from learned physicians or simple empirics, from all kinds of people, peasants, shepherds, soldiers, clerics, simple women, and people of all sorts. This was one of the main ways in which traditional medicine was being challenged in this period, and Paracelsus became one of its most vocal opponents. Paracelsus tells you all you need to know with the way he starts styling himself by 1529, as Paracelsus, so going beyond Celsus, Aulus Cornelius Celsus to be precise, a very respected 1st century Roman medical writer. So his new name made a statement about how his new medicine surpassed the ancient authorities, so revered in universities. This traditional medicine was based on a mix of Greco-Roman traditions and medieval contributions by Islamic physicians. So think of a combination of scholasticism, Aristotle, Hippocrates, Galen, and Ibn Sina, the prince of physicians. This medicine relied heavily on the humoral theory, so the idea that the body had 4 humors which had to be balanced for someone to be healthy, and also regulating the non-naturals, so sleep, exercise, emotions, diet, evacuation, and the air. By the way, let me know in the comments if you would like a video on these topics, because I'm planning, I think it might be interesting. I will also link in the description below a quick intro to both the humoral theory and the non-naturals that I wrote. So, this was the kind of medicine that was taught at Western universities, a Galenic medicine with a heavy focus on theory over practice, relying on logic and on ancient authorities. For Paracelsus, though, logic darkened the true light of nature, and he called Aristotle a sharp illusionist. So for him, the more learned someone was, the more their mind had been perverted. Paracelsus was not the only one to criticize this kind of medicine, but Paracelsianism kind of structured these criticisms and, more importantly, offered a new medical model. After leaving university and after years and years of traveling, Paracelsus settled in Strasbourg and quickly became a very popular physician. By 1527, when he was appointed town physician in Basel, Switzerland, his disregard for tradition was clear. His new position meant that he became a professor at the city's medical college, a stronghold of Galenic medicine. Now, he was supposed to lecture physicians and students there, which he decided to do based on his practical experience with the quote-unquote secrets of disease. His colleagues were not thrilled, to say the least, and they even denied him the room to lecture. But, to the local authorities' shock, he decided to open the invitation to his lectures to anyone who was interested, and he would teach wherever he could. Plus, he chose to do so in common German rather than in Latin, the language of universities. Now, keep in mind that this was just 10 years after Martin Luther had written his thesis on indulgences, criticizing the Catholic establishment. Paracelsus seemed to be doing the same with medicine. He was even called a medical Luther. Later, he would write, I leave it to Luther to defend himself, and I will be responsible for what I say. That which you wish to Luther, you also wish to me. You wish us both in the fire. As though that wasn't enough to enrage the university physicians, a few weeks later, Paracelsus reportedly went even further. He burned the books of Ibn Sina and Galen in a clear sign of his hostility towards learned medicine. Again, this echoed Luther burning a papal bull that threatened excommunication. So, as you can tell, Paracelsus caused a lot of controversy. Just imagine what physicians thought when he argued that any barber or midwife had more common sense than Aristotle and Galen. As other medical reformers of the time, like Fioravanti, whom I quoted earlier, this confrontational style towards the medical establishment meant that he didn't really stay anywhere for long. The criticisms against him were vitriolic. Poems circulated in Basel mocking him, calling him Cacophrastus. Cacophrastus, a sort of scatological pun on his name, Theophrastus. His medicine was criticized as unethical and dangerous, and he was called vain and coarse, full of peasant wisdom. But Paracelsus was unfazed. He wrote, "Don't reject my writings because I'm lonely, because I'm new, or because I'm German." But if Paracelsus was rejecting Galenic medicine, what was he proposing instead? Iatrochemistry, or medical chemistry, is key to understanding Paracelsus. His time in the mining school had been crucial to how he saw the world. His new natural philosophy was based on what he called chemical principles: salt, mercury, and sulfur. They were the primary substance in nature, according to him. He considered the traditional Galenic and Aristotelic system of humors, qualities, and elements to be a bit too passive and associated them with femininity. His new triad, the tria prima, on the other hand, was composed of active materials, which he believed to be more male in their nature. Of course, it's easy to see just how much the beliefs about gender and the roles people played in society influenced his thinking, but I digress. Anyway, so he associated salt with solidity, spirituousness with mercury, and sulfur with inflammability, and described the world as being sort of full of vital and spiritual forces. Now, why is that relevant to medicine? Well, Paracelsus thought that poisonous emanations from minerals in the earth could cause disease. For instance, he wrote how miners' disease, known today as silicosis, was caused by inhaling metal vapors. And here there's another fundamental difference between Paracelsianism and Galenic medicine. Paracelsus believed that diseases came from outside the body, that they originated from contact with contaminating materials, and not from internal humoral imbalances. Traditionally, if you understood the body's health as being dependent on the balance between the four humors, that meant that treatments tended to correct this imbalance. So if someone had an excess of phlegm, for instance, a cold and moist humor, they would need a remedy of opposite qualities to make the body warmer and drier. Paracelsus, on the other hand, believed in curing like with like. So physicians should treat someone poisoned by minerals with another mineral, essentially, instead of just herbal remedies. Now, that might sound dangerous, and it was, but for Paracelsus, the body had its own kind of internal alchemist, as it were, meaning that the body was capable of separating what was harmful from what was helpful when ingested. He wrote that what makes a man ill also heals him, if in small doses. So it's this idea that it's the dose that makes the poison. During an outbreak of plague in Stettin in 1534, for instance, it said that he treated many people with a remedy made of bread and a tiny bit of the person's excrement. Disgusting, I know, and I can't see how that was effective, but hey, that's what people said. Still, these chemical remedies could be particularly helpful in dealing with new diseases, such as syphilis, which he recommended should be treated with formulas using mercury to be taken internally, which of course we know is dangerous now, please don't do it. Anyway, chemical remedies could contain, yes, I see you, iron, copper sulfate, and sulfur too. But of course, using chemical medicines wasn't something he just invented. Since antiquity, writers such as Dioscorides had discussed, yes, chemical and mineral remedies, and the same goes for medieval physicians and alchemists, such as Arnaldo Villanova and Ramon Lull. And they had all influenced Paracelsus. So these earlier writers had praised distillation as a way of making herbs more potent by obtaining their essences. And in the 15th century, distillation had become widely popular, especially in German-speaking areas, thanks to the publication of Hieronymus Braunschweig's books on distillation. So Paracelsus wasn't creating new medicines in a vacuum. There already existed this tradition connecting herbal and chemical medicine. What was new about Paracelsus was a move towards specificity in medicine. So disease had a specific external cause. It was an entity. And you can see the parallels with modern medicine and the ontological theory of disease. So not only were diseases connected to specific body parts as opposed to the more holistic Galenic view of medicine, but they should be treated with specific remedies, which could be very extreme. Many of these drastic remedies contained antimony, which is known today as a moderately toxic semi-metallic element, which has some properties similar to arsenic, another ingredient widely used in medicine in the last centuries. and very dangerous as well. Anyway, so Paracelsus would prescribe oil of antimony to patients suffering from leprosy. To treat such an aggressive disease, he thought you needed an aggressive remedy. So when patients were given these treatments, they could respond very quickly. There were visible effects, and that might have made them very popular. The same could be said for many drugs prescribed by empirics and charlatans at the time too. This was again in sharp contrast with Galenic medicines, which just weren't as dramatic. Plus, Paracelsus also suggested medicines that were enhanced versions of recipes already known. So he developed a new formula for pain using opium, which he called laudanum. And just a side note, this laudanum was very different in composition from the one that later became popular in Europe, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. Anyway, Paracelsus was interested in where within the body diseases could be localized. And this is one of the reasons why, like many other physicians of the period, he wasn't impressed by anatomy or dissection. He wrote that it should be called dead anatomy, as it wouldn't clarify how to cure any ailments or how the body worked, essentially leading nowhere. For us in the 21st century, that sounds very counterintuitive, I know, but dissection was very controversial. Oh, and by the way, let me know in the comments if you would be interested in a video about this, because I think dissection and its history it's a fascinating topic. In any case, Paracelsus did think that you could potentially do a dissection of urine of sorts. Let me explain. So, uroscopy, or the analysis of urine, had been a staple in medical practice for centuries, with physicians analyzing color, smell, etc. to diagnose disease. However, the idea of doing a chemical dissection of urine was new. It could be done, theoretically, using a big cylinder corresponding to the body. According to Paracelsus, after being distilled, the different components of urine, including mercury, sulfur, and salt, would be deposited in different parts of the vessel, and that would indicate where disease was located in the body. Of course, that sounds outlandish, but Paracelsus was trying to find new ways of solving age-old problems. Paracelsus was starting to understand the body through a chemical lens and to use chemical remedies, but this was still a time in which chemistry and alchemy were pretty much indistinguishable. His work definitely helped create the scientific field of chemistry and, of course, to reform medicine, but we should be careful not to only think of him as someone scientific and forward-looking. That would just be anachronistic and reductive. Paracelsus believed in the spiritual nature of the universe and in magic, as did many of his contemporaries. In the 16th and 17th centuries, people did believe in magic, and not just people who weren't instructed, but philosophers, scientists, jurists, and theologians. However, when later 18th and 19th century historians wrote about Paracelsus and his contribution to the scientific revolution and the history of medicine, they tended to leave out the mysticism behind his thinking. Paracelsus deeply believed that the universe, the microcosm, was connected to the human body, the microcosm, as many of his contemporaries did. Hi. So, the doctrine of signatures still played a big part in his thinking. The doctrine of signatures is a fascinating subject, and I wrote a little bit about it, so I will link the post down below in the description of the video. But to sum it up, it's an idea that dates back to antiquity and was popular through the medieval and early modern periods. So it was believed that God, when he created the world, imbued plants and animals and minerals too, to a smaller degree, with hidden properties, with the power to cure people suffering from illnesses. And the way people would learn about their properties would be by following clues, so by paying attention to smells, colors, textures, and the format of the plant. So for instance, a man who was suffering from impotence could use a remedy made with orchid roots, which resembled testicles. You get the idea. Anyway, astrological medicine also played a big part in how Paracelsus thought about medicine, with specific stars and planets affecting different body parts. So a good physician should be aware of all these correspondences in nature to treat their patients. And here we get to how natural magic and natural philosophy, as well as medicine, were connected in this period, and how alchemy could be a way of manipulating nature. For Paracelsus, as for many others at the time, such as Marsilio Ficino, Agrippa von Nettesheim, and Giambattista della Porta, who, by the way, is definitely another one of my favorites. He had a recipe allegedly given to him by a witch for a hallucinogenic formula. So let me know in the comments if you would like to hear about della Porta, flying witches, and the Inquisition. It's very interesting. Anyway, natural magic was essentially understanding how the universe, the celestial world, interacted with the natural and human worlds, and how these connections could be influenced and manipulated by people. Magic came from God, but it could be corrupted by necromancers. Still, Paracelsus wrote how people should know what the devil knows, meaning all kinds of magic. Physicians in particular should reclaim magic and restore it to its original purpose of helping and healing people. Although his medicine was clearly rooted in Christianism, Paracelsus was fascinated with mysticism in general, and he arguably opened the way to thinking about the connection between the mind and bodily diseases. In fact, the psychologist Carl Jung even saw him as a pioneer in what he called empirical psychological healing science, as well as chemical medicine. To give you an idea, Paracelsus thought that St. Vitus's dance, now called Sydenham chorea, a condition characterized by the uncontrollable trembling and jerking movements of the limbs, was an imaginative illness. He believed patients should abstain from sexual relations and fast, but also that they should create a doll that resembled them, a puppet of sorts, and destroy it. If this sounds to you like superstition, you're not wrong. And this is why, although some aspects of Paracelsus' work make him a pioneer, he was also very much a man of his time. Magical cures coexisted with chemical remedies. This cosmological, magical, religious framework of Paracelsus' writings wasn't accepted by everyone. The German physician Andreas Libavius, who wrote Alchemy, one of the foundational texts of chemistry as a discipline, criticized this Paracelsian cosmology and argued that chemical remedies should be combined with the Galenic medicine practiced by university physicians, sort of merging the two systems rather than having Iatrochemistry just take over. But even then, it was too late to save Galenic medicine, which was being attacked on several fronts by medical reformers. I told you a little bit about Paracelsus' ideas, but let's get back to the man himself. He had earned quite a reputation in Basel, with his controversial lectures and burning books and whatnot, and he was known for the prophecies he had published as well, based on astrology, so discussing things such as the 1531 comet, now known as Halley's Comet. By 1536, when the Great Surgery book was published, he had found several aristocratic patrons and made quite a bit of money too. Now, this was particularly important because, except for a few universities, he had largely been excluded from the academic world. Now, when we think about patronage today, we tend to think of artists, such as Botticelli being supported by the Medici family, but patrons were just as important for physicians and naturalists as they were for artists. Money could mean being able to set up a lab for experimentation, and being a court physician could protect Paracelsus from being attacked by university physicians and by local colleges of physicians as well. More importantly, patronage legitimized Paracelsian doctrines as a valid medical model. The same hadn't happened with other would-be medical reformers, such as Leonardo Fioravanti. By the 1640s, Joseph Duchesne, the personal doctor of King Henry IV of France and a Paracelsian himself, listed lots of kings and princes as supporters of Paracelsianism, especially in German-speaking areas. And they were instrumental in spreading this new medicine. Otto Heinrich, the Duke of Neuburg, was one of the first nobles to support Paracelsus, and the Duke's collected manuscripts even formed the basis for the later printed versions of Paracelsus' works. Keep in mind that in the early modern period, distillation and alchemy were discussed everywhere, and experimentation was a big part of court culture, from Henry IV's court in France to the Medici court in Florence and Spanish palaces. In Central and Eastern Europe, Paracelsianism was quickly spreading as well, with the courts in Prague and Vienna often holding public demonstrations of alchemical experimentation. This was a time of reform and transformation, not just in medicine and science, but also, of course, in terms of religion. And there is much overlap here. So Paracelsus remained a Catholic, technically, throughout his life, but he was probably highly influenced by Protestantism. Just remember how he was called the Luther of physicians. Paracelsus believed that both natural and spiritual knowledge could be found in nature, without the mediation of intermediaries such as universities. This echoed the Protestant idea of learning directly from the Bible without the direction of the Church. Not to mention that, just like Luther, Paracelsus chose to write and to lecture in German rather than in Latin. Plus, Paracelsus had reformist sentiments and beliefs which extended beyond religion to the domain of social order. For instance, when there was social unrest, such as the peasant revolts against lords in German-speaking areas, Paracelsus tended to side with the peasants rather than with the princes, the opposite of Luther. At the time of the Civil War in England, Paracelsianism just spread among Protestants, not only because of the new medical ideas, but also because of this religious reformism that they associated with Paracelsus. In the 1640s, Puritans advocated for Paracelsianism, arguing that it was a more charitable, more Christian kind of medicine. This association was arguably there from the very beginning. In Italy, in the second half of the 16th century, with the Catholic Reformation, Paracelsians were accused of heresy, and many of them went underground. Paracelsianism was linked with Protestantism, plus the focus on magic probably didn't help. So, although he seems to have remained a Catholic throughout his life, books by Paracelsus were placed on the Index Expurgatorius, a list of books from which parts considered immoral or contradicting Catholicism were removed. And, especially after his death, his followers, including many political and religious radicals, developed Paracelsianism in such a way that it expanded Paracelsus' reformist aura. Gradually, though, Paracelsian medicine spread and started to be adopted even by institutions that had long been strongholds of Galenic humoral medicine. By the 1560s, many of the pharmacopoeias printed in German areas included chemical remedies. Decades later, the Venetian College of Apothecaries included in its 1642 list of approved medicines several alchemical cures, sometimes called spagyric remedies. Now, official pharmacopoeias like these basically determined which medicines were acceptable. They acted as sort of pharmaceutical guides, often listing the ingredients and formulas as well. In the famous 1618 Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, the London Pharmacopoeia, there were parts dedicated to chemical preparations and explanations on salts, metals, and minerals. Over 100 chemical formulas were printed side by side with the traditional herbal medicines. And the pressure to take Paracelsian drugs seriously often came from royal courts, where Paracelsianism was thriving. For instance, in 1658, King Louis XIV of France was ill during a military campaign. Traditional remedies prescribed by the court physicians just hadn't worked. And, the story goes, a local Paracelsian doctor was able to cure the king with a drug using antimony that provoked vomiting. The medical faculty in Paris, which had long condemned using antimony, was forced to accept this vomit-inducing wine-based formula, for better or for worse. Anyway, the video is getting long enough as it is, so if people are interested, I can talk about Paracelsianism in other videos, since it's a fascinating topic. But for now, let me tell you the tale of the homunculus. Okay, stick with me, because this part of the video might seem a bit weird. And content warning, this bit is also slightly disgusting, so if you want to skip it, do it. I won't judge you. Anyway, in the early modern period, many people believed that rotting matter, so putrefied carcasses or cadavers, could produce life, such as bees, for instance. Putrefying earth or mud was believed to generate insects and worms. Now, this might sound strange to us, but think about it. What could people observe? What would they notice? Keep in mind that this is a time before germ theory, of course. Plus, there was this passage in the Bible saying, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures," which could be read literally, meaning that God would have made the elements, especially the earth, capable of creating life. Perhaps the most famous example of this idea of spontaneous generation comes from one of my all-time favorite history books, Carlo Ginzburg's The Cheese and the Worms, a masterpiece of microhistory, whose title evokes this very idea. So Ginzburg's research focuses on a miller, Menocchio, who believed that life could be created through putrefying matter, such as cheese. I won't get into too much detail about this, but suffice it to say that the idea of creating new life from decaying matter in a laboratory wouldn't necessarily be absurd for people at the time. And again, that's exactly the premise of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, only combined with electricity, of course, which was hotly debated in the scientific circles of her day. Plus, some alchemical substances, such as azoth, were believed to be able to give life and to cure all illnesses, which was also said about the Philosopher's Stone. So, keep this in mind. But we're talking of insects and worms in the Renaissance, and the case of the homunculus, like literally translated as a little human being, is different. This was problematic because we're talking about the artificial creation of a life form that would be similar to humans and rational. So this had, of course, moral and religious implications, and not surprisingly, the possibility was met with pushback from those who deemed it unnatural, but many others were fascinated with the possibility. So, drawing on this concept that new life could start with putrefaction and that the vital impulse in seed would always strive to create life, the idea would be to use human semen, so human seed, sealed in a vessel like a flask, and to warm it in a gentle heat until it putrefied. After 40 days, it would begin to move, and after 40 weeks, during which a chemical preparation made of human blood was added to it, there would be a homunculus, a life form resembling a human being. Keep in mind that a typical human pregnancy takes around 40 weeks too. So, in another version, the putrefied sperm would be placed inside a horse's womb. And it really makes you think of futuristic like ectogenesis, doesn't it? Anyway, this being, the homunculus, appeared in several texts attributed to Paracelsus and was described as transparent and bodiless. So people have imagined it in all kinds of different ways, including the version from the anime I quoted in the very beginning of the video. In earlier versions, it was a sort of golem-like creature. But what's so interesting to me is that this whole idea illustrates the fascination many people at the time, especially Paracelsus, had with seeing the invisible, of finding out how things worked and how the world was made. Of course, it's far-fetched, but for something written centuries ago, it also sounds so modern, so sci-fi. This homunculus would act as a metaphor for human creation and creativity, not to mention ingenuity. In any case, even though all this might sound crazy, it tells us a lot about the medical and scientific beliefs of the time. Let me know in the comments if you would like a video about how people thought of reproduction, or generation as it was called at the time, because it's a truly fascinating subject and there was a lot of controversy. In any case, this homunculus wouldn't be like a regular human child, even if it looked like one. Because it would be the product of art, of technique, rather than a natural process, this being would be born powerful and full of knowledge. Contrary to a normal baby, the homunculus would know all the arts and secrets of nature. So the opposite of how naive Frankenstein's monster was in the novel, too. Also, just as a side note, in one of the texts, which is debatable whether Paracelsus wrote himself, it is said that if instead of semen, you use menstrual blood, then it wouldn't be a homunculus that would be created, but rather a basilisk. Yes, just like in Harry Potter. So basilisks were symbols of unnatural births in general, and in another version, it came from an egg laid by a rooster rather than a hen, and was incubated by a toad. So lots of monster stories. But this monster would be a metaphor for unnatural reproduction. In terms of menstruation, it's significant that this is a monster that could kill just by its glance. Of course, this is reminiscent of myths and taboos about menstruation, from menstrual blood dulling mirrors to the story of the Medusa. And this is another topic that I'm very interested in, so let me know in the comments if you'd like a video about the history of menstruation. I'm fascinated by that. Having said that, this is not exactly a straightforward experiment to recreate. Few people at the time, even alchemists, would have been interested in following this bizarre recipe. But the topic itself, the idea of creating life from dead matter, chemical palingenesis, was widely debated. So, physicians and alchemists experimented in other ways by trying to resuscitate dead animals and plants chemically, using Paracelsian ideas such as Scheidung, or the separation of different parts from a substance, which could be done through distillation. For instance, mixing the ashes of burnt wood to distillates, heating it, and burying it. Joseph Duchenne, a follower of Paracelsus that I mentioned earlier, wrote about this and experimented with nettles, which personally sounds much better than the original formula, Anyway, in the following centuries, people continued to experiment. Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scientist, even wrote that he made a demonstration to Queen Christina of Sweden in 1657, while the famous physician Jan Baptist van Helmont wrote that this experiment was just impossible. Sir Kenelm Digby also wrote that he was able to recreate this nettle experiment at the Gresham College in London in 1660. By the way, just as a side note, a while back I went through the Digby family recipe book, which contains everything from medicine to alchemy to cosmetics and whatnot, and I happened to come across Leonardo Fioravanti's recipe for the Philosopher's Stone. So it just goes to show how these people were all aware of each other's work and how interconnected was this network of early modern alchemists. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, please go and check out my video on Leonardo Fioravanti, a charlatan alchemist that I kind of love. The main takeaway from this homunculus story is the idea of the enormous potential that alchemy and chemistry offered in exploring the world. And lest we forget, the idea of producing human beings in a lab is very much a part of our present day. Just think of IVF and of our future too. Using alchemy to advance medicine and to explain cosmological ideas is a big part of Paracelsus' work and his legacy. Arguably for Paracelsus, the pinnacle of what science could achieve was perhaps best exemplified by the tale of the homunculus. If I haven't lost you with the slightly disturbing tale of the homunculus, great, thank you if you're still with me. Now, there are lots of gaps in the historical records about Paracelsus, and because many of his ideas were so quickly adopted by many different people in different ways, it's tricky sometimes to separate Paracelsus from Paracelsianism. That's why I decided to make a separate video about Paracelsianism and digestion, which is coming out soon, as to sort of complement this one, as it were. For what it's worth, I think Bruce Moran, who wrote a fantastic biography of Paracelsus, I think he's right. We have to try to stick to the primary sources as much as we can, especially the texts written by Paracelsus himself. Even then, Paracelsus created a persona, and some stories do seem like exaggerations. His life, works, and long-lasting influence are all incredibly complex topics, and I've only skimmed the surface here. There's so much more that could be said. And that's what's so intriguing about Paracelsianism. It was such a patchwork, such a mix of traditions that it was open to interpretation and to being reinvented in all kinds of ways. Just think of the anime I mentioned in the beginning and the character Hohenheim of Light. The one thing that remained constant was a sort of anti-establishment rhetoric and the importance given to chemical medicine. Although not everyone interested in iatrochemistry would have thought of themselves as a Paracelsian. We can roughly say that two kinds of Paracelsianisms developed after his death. One which took the cosmology and mysticism behind chemical medicine very seriously, which was the model adopted by most of the royal courts who supported Paracelsianism. And another one which excluded this philosophical framework and consisted basically on the chemical drugs themselves. This was a more popular kind of Paracelsianism, and it was adopted by apothecaries and surgeons. It was this second kind that had the longest life. In the 19th and 20th centuries, English and German historians of medicine praised Paracelsus for his reformist ideas and his new chemical drugs, while dismissing his ideas about magic, astrology, and alchemy. Paracelsus was a medical reformer. He rejected learned medicine in favor of empirical learning. He pushed the boundaries of experimentation, not only with the homunculus, but with poisons too, which I didn't have the time to cover in this video. He was instrumental in transforming medicine through chemistry. And he changed pharmaceutical practice by creating specific remedies, rejecting this holistic idea of healing. But we should be mindful not to focus exclusively on what now, in hindsight, may seem forward-looking. He was a man of his time. He took magic seriously, and it was a big part of his work. Empiricism coexisted with mysticism, and Paracelsus didn't see a contradiction in this. This dichotomy between rational and irrational, so characteristic of the 18th century and the Enlightenment, wouldn't make any sense for someone like him, living in the early modern period. And I think that's why I'm personally so interested in the stories of people like him and Leonardo Fioravanti. Besides being, sort of larger than life characters full of incredible stories, they were also people full of apparent contradictions. They make us rethink concepts, generalizations, and strict divisions. They make things more complex and I think more interesting. Paracelsus was called everything from a genius to a romantic hero, a rebel, a militant, and a pioneer of modern medicine, depending on who was writing the story. Paracelsus was even used by the as a nationalist idol, but that's a rabbit hole for another day. In any case, I will be releasing a sort of shorter video on Paracelsianism soon and how his ideas affected medicine and ideas about physiology in general, such as how the digestive process worked. And again, if you're interested in this subject, I highly suggest you check out the reading recommendations in the description below. I'm also thinking of making a video about women alchemists of this period. There were lots. So let me know in the comments if you would be interested in that. Also, if you enjoyed this video, despite the homunculus, or who knows, maybe because of him, do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I also have a Patreon and I would be very grateful if you considered supporting my work that way. Thank you and see you next time.